In the contemporary era, salt is an inexpensive commodity, scattered indiscriminately across winter roads to melt ice. But for the vast majority of human history, this simple crystalline compound was a matter of life and death, an absolute biological requirement that dictated the boundaries of human settlement. The human body is completely incapable of manufacturing its own sodium or chloride. These specific ions are required to regulate blood pressure, facilitate nerve impulses, and enable the rhythmic beating of the heart. For millions of years, nomadic hunter-gatherers absorbed adequate amounts of these electrolytes indirectly, obtaining them from the blood-rich meat of the herbivores they tracked. The Neolithic Revolution altered that dietary balance. As early humans transitioned from nomadic hunting to sedentary agriculture, their diet shifted heavily toward domesticated cereal grains and vegetables. Because plants generally contain a much lower sodium content than animal tissue, this sudden dietary shift induced a severe biological deficit. Agricultural societies were forced by sheer physiological necessity to actively seek out and consume supplemental salt to prevent hyponatremia. The expansion of agrarian human civilization was inextricably tied to the mandatory acquisition of an exceedingly scarce terrestrial mineral. Beyond internal biology, salt possessed a unique chemical property that offered an escape from the natural decay of the seasons. When applied to organic tissue, sodium chloride aggressively draws moisture out of cells through osmosis, creating a hypertonic environment where bacteria cannot survive. Before the invention of refrigeration, this desiccation process was the only reliable mechanism for the long-term storage of harvested protein. Curing meats allowed ancient societies to stockpile massive caloric surpluses, enabling armies to march vast distances, protecting maritime explorers on transoceanic voyages, and insulating populations against winter famines. Ancient Egyptians utilized this drying property so effectively that they relied on it to preserve the dead. Embalmers packed the eviscerated bodies of pharaohs in dry natron, a highly alkaline mixture of sodium carbonate and sodium bicarbonate, for exactly 40 days, desiccating the flesh entirely to maintain an intact physical vessel for the afterlife. By solving the existential crisis of food spoilage, salt evolved into a strategic geopolitical asset. Regardless of the geographic difficulty or financial cost, agricultural populations had to acquire it. The geographic mismatch between where populations naturally sought to establish agrarian societies and where salt naturally occurred created a profound economic vacuum. This spatial void was rapidly filled by merchants and engineers who developed highly specialized techniques to extract it from hostile environments. This map identifies early extraction sites, showing how isolated societies independently engineered complex methods to harvest the mineral. In Hallstatt, Austria, laborers chiseled salt from deep mine shafts. Compare that to massive brine boiling in China or submerged salt kitchens in Belize. Moving these heavy bulk loads across continents required immense logistical planning. To cross the deep Sahara Desert, indigenous Berber and Tuareg nomads organized caravans of up to 12,000 camels, transporting heavy slabs of rock salt across months of unforgiving terrain to the salt-starved alluvial gold regions of West Africa. The logistical necessity of moving this heavy bulk resource across hostile terrain physically shaped the infrastructural development of entire continents, charting the trade routes that would dictate regional hegemony for centuries. Early prospectors and warlords recognized a foundational truth of ancient geopolitics. Whoever controlled the flow of salt inherently controlled the population that depended upon it. This bar chart illustrates how the Tang dynasty weaponized app demand. Following the An Lushan Rebellion, the central Chinese government lost military control over vast swaths of its taxable agricultural land. By pivoting to an indirect tax on coastal salt production, the state generated staggering revenues that surpassed all other forms of taxation combined, keeping a crippled empire financially solvent. In medieval Europe, the Republic of Venice constructed a sprawling maritime empire using a similar approach. Venice secured dominance by enforcing a ruthless legal monopoly, requiring that all salt moving through the Adriatic Sea be transported on Venetian ships and routed directly through their customs houses. Because subject populations could not opt out of consuming salt, ancient governments realized that creating legal monopolies over its distribution allowed them to exact a highly reliable toll on the populace, thus establishing a bedrock of state revenue. State taxation of a mineral with perfectly inelastic demand was exceptionally effective. But when governments pushed that taxation to extortionate levels, prioritizing imperial treasuries over public health, salt rapidly transformed from an administrative tool into a primary catalyst for outright warfare. The French crown instituted the gabelle, a deeply unequal system that legally obligated citizens to purchase inflated, state-mandated amounts of salt annually, regardless of their actual need or ability to pay. This draconian law fueled a massive underground economy of armed smugglers and triggered the systemic grievances that ultimately shattered the French monarchy during the Revolution. In the 19th century, the British Empire utilized a similar strategy as a weapon of colonial economic extraction in India. To rigorously prevent the smuggling of cheap, untaxed sea salt, the administration constructed a densely planted, thorny hedge stretching over 2,500 miles across the subcontinent. This artificial inflation of salt prices caused immense suffering for the rural poor and heavily exacerbated state-sponsored famines. The sheer cruelty of this extractive tax provided the moral spark for Mahatma Gandhi's 1930 Salt March to the Sea. It became a pivotal moment of nonviolent civil disobedience that galvanized the Indian independence movement against British colonial rule. The mineral itself did not inherently possess the power to destroy empires. Rather, the arrogant taxation of a biological necessity exposed the critical fault lines and administrative fragility of massive state bureaucracies. The absolute economic tyranny of salt was ultimately broken not by political reform or military conquest, but by the unstoppable forces of the Industrial Revolution and advances in chemical engineering. Chemists Nicolas Leblanc and Ernest Solvay invented highly efficient processes that synthesized soda ash directly from common sodium chloride. These methods turned a heavily guarded dietary treasure into a cheap, high-volume industrial feedstock required by the millions of tons for glass, soap, and textile manufacturing. Concurrently, the rapid development of mechanical refrigeration allowed perishable proteins to be safely transported across entire continents. The ability to artificially lower ambient temperatures below the threshold of bacterial growth meant that society was no longer biologically tethered to the salt barrel for winter survival. As salt lost its strategic hegemony, the mechanics of global geopolitical power shifted to entirely new resources. The survival and security of modern empires became predicated on the control of fossil fuels for mechanized industry, uranium for power generation, and silicon for advanced microprocessors. While the specific commodities have changed, the underlying mechanisms of geopolitical control remain intact. The strategy of state monopolies and the desperate necessity of securing supply lines operate exactly as the world's first salt merchants established them millennia ago.